Welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies.
Yes, we've just seen The Post.
Yes.
Which I was talking to my sister over the weekend, and she was saying, "Oh my God, I'm avoiding that like the plague. It's so It seems so stinkingly earnest, or something like that."
But she hadn't seen it.
She hadn't seen it, so it's just kind of the impression, that is given by the project. Spielberg doing a serious project with Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep, who are arguably the most prestigious, male and female actors of the day, in this kind of important historical narrative. And
about how great America is and the First Amendment, you imagine.
Yes. And it does feel so worthy and so on that, I wasn't very eager to see it. So I'm very glad I saw it, though.
I was eager to see it because it's Spielberg and Streep and Hanks, and it looked interesting. And what can I say? I like that kind of thing. I mean, to be fair, I was also enormously eager to see Lincoln because it was Spielberg and Daniel Day-Lewis doing a biopic of the greatest president ever. It's like, man, it's going to be amazing. Of course, it turned out to be kind of dull.
It was very dull. It was extremely dull.
But that didn't dampen...
Very handsome to look at.
Yeah, but that didn't dampen my enthusiasm for this. I thought, this is going to be proper quality.
You see, the thing about my relationship to Spielberg is that I can't remember when was the last time I had a really good time at his movies.
Catch Me If You Can?
We have to skip that one because actually, I've never been able to see it all the way through.
Really?
Yes.
How come?
It's just one of those things. I think I missed it at the cinema. I tried to watch it on TV. I fell asleep. I tried again. I'm a big fan of Leonardo DiCaprio.
It's a great film.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of
energy. I
energy.
saw bits on TV, so... But even if you accept that that's the last time for you, that's, 15 years ago?
Well, no, I was suggesting that would be the last time for you. Because I'm thrilled by pretty much everything I see of his, regardless.
Come on.
I love it. I love
Bridge?
Bridge of Spies?
Yeah.
I love that film. I think that's a great little film. I know it's got its problems. It has the thing of how... I watched it again recently.
I know, you said you'd watched it 20 times or something absurd.
I watched it again recently to confirm how much I liked it, and it's true that I do like it. And there is that one bit in it where it's there's the Russian spy who's in the American jail, and there's the American spy who's in the Russian jail, and the American spy in the Russian jail is being treated badly, and the walls are covered in dirt, and he's being woken up in the morning and tortured, blah, blah, blah. And then it cuts to the Russian spy being kept in the American jail, and they say, "Sir, we need to speak to you." And it's there's no fucking way they were that nice.
I mean...
But there is the construction of the plot and the way the scenes work and the way the camera moves. That is an exquisite film, Bridge of Spies.
He's incrededly skilled.
The craft is unparalleled.
That's true. And actually, I think that's true of this film as well.
Yeah.
Kind of everything about it is really interesting, except its view of life and the culture and the country. Everything seems shallow.
You're talking about this or Bridge of Spies?
Both, because I think they both suffer from the same problems, really.
Okay. Well, I must say that I saw this earlier than you did today because I had stuff to do. So I saw an earlier screening, and while you were seeing it just now, and I knew you were in the cinema, I was thinking to myself, I'm kind of jealous that you're seeing. Like I wanted to see it again.
My God, okay.
Yeah. It's not to say that I'm in love with it, but I wanted to see it.
Let me put it this way: I liked it much more than Bridge of Spies, and I think it's a very timely film. It's about the importance of the press. And the press as a safeguard of, democracy in the U.S. and, how the presidency is not the state and, how to have the right to publish is to publish. If you don't publish, then you lose the right. And, how democracy requires a free press, which, I think is absolutely true. The film is very timely in terms of Fox News and the Trump presidency. We live in a situation where the press, deserves our support and our protection more than ever. And I think we're losing it, really. So the film has all of those good things, and and a lot of skill. And actually, for me, it's nostalgic. I mean, I remember kind of, as a school child going to the Montreal Star to get, to see how the press worked. And it was just like this with the molten lead, and all us kids got our names typed. I think I actually have mine still in my desk. My name typed in molten lead as if it were like, Times New Roman or something. And of course, and then I worked in it, as a typesetter for many years just after uni. So for me, it also has all that romance and nostalgia of this idealized view of what newspapers should do, and kind of everybody in the newsroom trying to get the story and, fighting the government. So I liked it much more than Bridge of Spies, but it still feels like a very old-fashioned 1940s film to me. I mean, there's a scene where I think it's Catherine Graham, they come out of the courthouse, they come through this crowd, and all the crowd looks worshipfully at her, right? And I thought, this is really out of a 1940s war film or something.
That was something, before we go on, obviously, spoilers.
Yes.
Well, maybe we should talk about it quickly, because that's something I made note of, is when she comes out of the courtrooms, they've gone to the Supreme Court, because Nixon is basically trying to shut down the newspapers, trying to publish the Pentagon Papers, which means that the Washington Post and the New York Times, who have up to this point been rivals, are now on the same side. And they emerge from the court having made their case, and she emerges into this crowd of hippies, and the hippies are all women, I noticed. We had seen hippies of both genders before, hanging out and making speeches and singing songs. So there was something very deliberate about that. She emerges into a crowd of women, because I don't think the film up till this point has hugely foregrounded the fact that she is a woman in a world of men. It has, but it hasn't. It's not its main focus.
Actually, that's another thing that I really liked about this film, because if you think about it, so on the one hand you think, it's a two-hander. Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep, but it really isn't. It's Meryl Streep's film, and the issue of her being a woman and her being a publisher, and what women's roles were and how they accepted them then, but they don't now, and actually all the supporting characters that kind of feed onto her narrative, right? So so the assistant to the DA at the end, who's working against the other side, but So actually, there's something that's being said about the role of women and women being silenced.
That's certainly true. But it's I suppose what I'm saying then, at that point in the film, when she walked through this crowd of women, is that it's very conspicuous at that point. It was to me. I noticed it, and I guess the film's saying something about how these two kind of sets of people are different. One of them is a group of young hippies, and the other is business people in suits and courtrooms, but they are linked at this point, and they're fighting for the same thing, and she's kind of accepted into this crowd by them, and it's clearly tied to gender at this point. If it were a male CEO or owner of the company, it wouldn't be the same.
No, not at all. And I think a lot is made out of her being a society woman. And so she wears Chanel to all the lunches, and she's a very good hostess, and kind of she's fashionable in a conservative staid way. I think she wears Chanel suits throughout the first part, and then you see her at the end in like Pucci, like this kind of print dress, kind of more free and flowing at the end.
A little bit tie-dye almost.
Yeah, well,
it's not tie-dye, but it more resembles that.
Yeah. And I remember actually because, she was a very important society figure. She was very, very rich. As the film points out, she knew everybody, the Kennedys and the Johnsons and everybody. I remember reading about her because for a while I was really into the Mitford sisters. I don't know if you know about the Mitford sisters.
A little bit.
Yeah, one was, one went with the communists and the other one, and became like a barnstorming kind of reporter. And then there was Nancy Mitford, who wrote these kind of very witty romantic novels, and then there was Diana who married Walter Mosley. Yeah.
The fascist.
The fascist.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Jessica Mitford, who was the one who became the rabble-rousing kind of reporter and so on, was, great friends with Catherine Graham, and writes kind of extensively about kind of, being received by her in Washington when she was, like, in America, as a member of the Communist Party and so on. And they were great friends, right? So, seemingly an open-minded person.
There is something that I have a problem with in the characterization of Catherine Graham, which is that she is in her 60s, I guess.
Yes.
She's a lady of slightly advanced years.
Yes.
And she seems to be struggling to be competent at her job.
That's not the way I felt. You see, my feeling was that she is very competent at her job. She's struggling to assert her authority that her competence should grant her.
That's certainly true as well. But so she's basically pressured at the start of the film. The film has this running thread of the papers going under, business-wise, and they need to make an initial public offering to the stock exchange.
Oh, that's not about the public going under. No, the stock exchange thing is separate. So they want to build the paper into a national paper.
Well, there's that, but it's also they also talk about if we don't do this, we won't have the paper
that's
anymore.
Different. That's part of the narrative. So initially, they're putting out this stock offering to build the paper, but it has this clause, that it could all be taken away if it's a catastrophe or something.
No, but they do talk about we are out of money, and we need to do this in order to save the paper. It's not just about building it. They do want to make it into a national concern, but they do also make a big point of this stock offering is not just about growing it, it's about saving it.
Oh, I missed that.
They do, I promise you.
Right.
But anyway, that's not the point. The point is just that they are they are putting it on the stock exchange, and she.
I thought she was one of those, international super rich.
Well, be that as it may, this is not the story that the film is telling exactly. So the idea is that they're putting it on the stock exchange, and she is fumbling over her notes, and like she's practiced the answers to the questions that will be asked of her early in the film, and then she stumbles over them later, and she stumbles over the speech that she gives to the stock exchange when they kind of all agree that they say welcome to the stock exchange, and then she has to say a few words, and she's nervous and bumbling, and the film's playing up that she is a fish out of water. To the extent where I was kind of thinking, how did she even make it this far? I think the film is overplaying it.
Yes.
You're right that it is about her assertion of her ability to do a job, but actually I think the film is that comes across at least as her inability to do a job at certain points. And actually, when she eventually says we're going to publish, it's still done with this breaking voice of go, let's go.
Yes.
Of
finding her voice.
As opposed to just I'm in charge here.
Yes. I don't know. I found all of that quite good. The performances are wonderful, except to me that they're not. So let me clarify. I think they're wonderful in the sense that they're rich. There's a really full characterization. You can see how skilled the people involved are, and that applies to both, Hanks and Streep. But neither of them, to me, surprise or bring joy. This just like really skilled. Yeah.
I know what you mean.
So there's they're very staid, and actually I hate this kind of, worshipfulness of celebrity. Like you feel that, there's something stultifying and, that takes life away. That too much appreciation takes life away from performers, really. That they suffer from like legend worship or something. And I think that shows a bit in these performances of Hanks.
It reminds me of an article that I think you probably sent me a couple of years ago, which was about famous actors performing on stage in New York, and how like Jeff Goldblum is in a play, and the moment he steps on stage, the play stops because there's 2 minutes of applause.
Yes.
Just because he's shown up.
Yes.
There seems to be a feeling of that. It's like, and now Meryl Streep.
Yes.
And now Tom Hanks.
Yes.
And you're never quite watching their characters. You're always watching they are Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks, not Catherine Graham and Ben Bradley.
That's right. Though, you know, I do think Streep is more successful at that.
Yeah.
Just because you've seen her be so different in so many recent roles. I mean, I absolutely love her Florence Foster Jenkins. You know, I think she and Hugh Grant are terrific. You know, and just her singing makes me laugh, really. Like, but like bursts, you know, kind of. And she's a comic genius in a way. I remember in that film, like, every time she would change a note, it was like almost like Lubitsch, where a laugh builds on top of a laugh and on top of a laugh just through her pitch. You know, I thought she was fantastic in that. And I'm not a fan, really. Like, for many years I thought, well, she's not a real star because, you know, she doesn't bring people in. Like, people never... I don't think audiences warm to her until The Devil Wears Prada, right?
Okay.
And I have a theory that actually, you know, she wasn't in any hit where she was the central character. All her big hits were, you know, with Robert Redford in Out of Africa, or Robert De Niro and The Deer Hunter, and, you know, Woody Allen, or, that actually the films that were built just around her, like, you know, what's the one with...
Sophie's Choice, Kramer versus Kramer?
Well, Kramer versus Kramer was with Dustin Hoffman. I think, I suppose Sophie's Choice was her film, and it was a hit, though not a big box office hit. It was a very big critical hit, which she managed always. But, you know, was it like Cry in the Dark, really, where she's, you know, magnificent, but so cold, right? And that made like 2 cents, basically, you know. So films like that, like, I think she had a whole run of those films where I just think the audiences didn't warm up to her until she became middle-aged in The Devil Wears Prada, really. Yeah. So anyway, that's just my theory. I haven't, you know, I'd have to look up all her films and demonstrate it.
I think you might be right, to be honest. I think you might be right. But then she got to Mamma Mia, and that's the most important thing.
Well, she then had so many hits where she was really the headlining star, you know, and they were all, like, quite good. There's the film that she made about Julia Child, right?
Julie and Julia.
Yeah, Julie and Julia, you know, where really she's the show. And it was like, and she carried it, really. You know, and then there was that lovely film with Alec Baldwin about a middle-aged couple divorcing or because they can't have sex or something. And that was kind of lovely, and she carried that as well. And, you know, those were really her hits.
And, of course, there was The Iron Lady, where she played Thatcher.
I don't think that was a big box office hit, but
Really?
No, I don't think so.
We'll find out.
But I thought she was magnificent.
Well, I mean, it made $115 million on a $10 million budget.
That's a big hit. Yeah.
There you go. I mean, she basically, like, her portrayal of Thatcher was kind of, it was on lines of what's her face playing the Queen.
Helen Mirren,
yeah.
Yeah.
That kind of level of identification.
Okay, fair enough. You know, so by American standards, there was certainly, you know, that wouldn't be a big hit, right? Because that's international. It's not just like, you know, what did it do in the U.S. domestic?
Oh, I don't know. Give me a second. I was only looking on Wikipedia. 2 seconds. Domestic was 30 million. Foreign was 84.
So
that's still 3 times its budget.
Yes.
I mean, it's a film of a certain size. Like, it's never going to make, you know, kind of Avengers money.
But those things are complex because, sure, it's a film of a certain size with one of the biggest stars in the world.
Yeah. No, I take your point.
Anyway, I just find it interesting that in a way, audiences really warmed to her. She became truly a star, kind of, in my mind, when she became middle-aged.
Yeah.
And actually, when she played comedy and being middle-aged, really. You know, so they're two... And I think she's kept the audience's affections ever since. You know, and there's a lot of goodwill towards her, though, you know, she's got her detractors. But then so does everybody. Anyway, I think she's quite good in this, and she actually does paint depict or portray a rounded character. You do see the wheel spinning, you know. The dresses, the intonations, the formal way that she speaks, But anyway, I liked it, you know.
Yeah.
So let's get on to more what you think, because I'm sure you have more articulate things to say.
I suppose the other thing to think about in terms of the craft is that I adore Spielberg's direction, and I love how he holds shots and the way he moves the camera to kind of keep everything interestingly or beautifully framed, and he lets scenes run. He lets the actors act.
Yes.
The scene in which you first, the scene in which Streep and Hanks first have a conversation is over lunch. So she's the proprietor, he's the editor, and they're discussing something. Well, they're discussing a range of things. And it's a really long scene. It's got to be a good 3 or 4 minutes, and it's a single take, the whole thing. And the camera moves to frame everything, and then it ultimately just parks in this 2-shot, and you just get to see the actors act, and it's actually quite theatrical. You get to see there are pauses, and then the conversation moves on, and this is all happening in one go. And I thought, this is confident and brilliant. Like there's actually the kind of the steady hand controlling this kind of inspires confidence in you as an audience member.
Yes, I mean the film is very assured. I mean that was true of Bridge of Spies as well. You know, kind of the way that he moves the camera is always like, you know, he's a genius at it, and there's no other way of putting it. But I think there are grounds for criticism. I mean, I think kind of, you know, to me the film isn't complex enough, really. And, you know, where I was saying that it's kind of designed, you know, as a 1940s raise people's spirit kind of rah-rah film. I mean it, right? Like the film is designed to get people pumped up over a free press, you know, and kind of leave people thinking that it's absolutely essential to American history and American health. And I think a lot of things are compromised when, you know, that's your goal, you know, like truth.
It's funny, I think I was actually expecting, especially given Lincoln, which was about kind of it was about the 13th Amendment and the abolishment of slavery, and the kind of the will of a man to do something great and to improve the American system, how great the American system kind of was. I guess I was expecting something kind of similarly right on. It was going to all be about the First Amendment, and the First Amendment is great. We must defend it, and we have to use it, and the system is what makes America great. The fact that we have this Constitution, that's kind of what I thought it would be. And there are certainly elements of that. There's particularly one very cringy moment towards the end where everyone's in the Washington Post offices, and the Supreme Court decision is coming through on whether they're allowed to publish or not. And the girl's on the phone, and everyone's listening, and she says, "It's 6-3. We've got the decision." Everyone cheers, and then she recites, hearing it over the phone.
So
she recites the opinion of the judge who was in favour, and it's something along the lines of, "The First Amendment was designed for blah blah blah, and we must have the right." I think I might have written it down a little bit. The press works for the governed, not the governing, or something like that. And the strings are swelling underneath. You go, "Oh, really? You're doing this?"
Yes.
It's so over the. And there are a couple of moments. There's also one in the courtroom just a few moments before, where the girl who works for the government is leading Catherine Graham through to the room, and she stops and says, "I know I work for the government, and my boss wouldn't want me to say this."
I mentioned that scene earlier.
But I want you to win.
Yeah.
You know? And then I thought, maybe, but because I thought actually that's not entirely awful, because I think it really bears in relation to the Trump White House and how everyone in the Trump White House is speaking out about how much they hate it there. They can't stop the leaks, and everyone inside hates it there and hates the place they are. So I thought, you know, this isn't so bad. But then this young girl who's said this is like berated by her boss disproportionately for doing nothing wrong, really.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, really? How much do you want to play this up that like there are good guys and bad guys?
Yeah. Well, I think that was also meant to play up the connection of her as a woman in relation to the Streep character.
Yeah.
But you know, there's too many emotional manipulations that are kind of unwarranted in a way, that it's just a way of getting the audience head up for American values, and it feels like really conservative. So on the one hand, it's kind of doing something that I suppose might be seen as liberal at the moment. I kind of, the press is in danger and he's standing up. This film is standing up for the value of the press, especially at this kind of key historical moment that the film is dealing with. But on the other hand, it feels like manipulative.
Well, what I was going to say is, you clearly feel that way, and what I was going to say is, those two examples aside, I don't actually think the film is doing very much of that. And I think actually, and this is what surprised me, and pleasantly surprised me, because I expected this fist-pumping First Amendment type thing, and actually what I got was, the central characters at the Washington Post are. Their emotional tone isn't about aren't we great because we're journalists and we have this. What their tone is, it's vile and it's hateful and it's depressing and it's pessimistic, because what it's about is how much they loathe the government for the lies that they've told about Vietnam and how they've lied about it for 30 years. The Pentagon Papers go back to Eisenhower and Truman. And how they've been telling lies about Vietnam, and then there's this stat that comes up, which is from Robert McNamara, the Defence Secretary, I think, something like that, who's a friend of Katharine Graham's, and he says the reasons that we're in Vietnam are 10% to help the South Vietnamese, they're 20% to fight communism, and they're 70% to avoid humiliating defeat. So, and she says, in basically these words, 70% of the boys that we sent to die there did so that we could avoid humiliating defeat.
So that the president could avoid humiliating defeat.
Right. So the tone is much more about the hatred of what the government specifically has done, as opposed to how good it is that we can use a free press to expose it.
Well, I take your point.
I found that quite bracing.
Well, I take your point, and I agree that is one of the things that the film does. But I think it is also very idealized and romantic about the press. And actually in kind of cliche terms, right? They find the source, they call, on secret phones, they go to a motel-type place to pick up the documents in secret. People work all through the night. There's that cliche of, making the press at the last minute, right? They don't get the papers delivered. If they don't put the paper to press now, it won't get to the delivery vans, right? So kind of, those are all...
That's true too.
Those are all kind of...
That's true too. But I suppose that I mean, you are absolutely right about that. It is full of cliches of that nature.
Yeah.
And also like the way that the actual printing presses are shot and edited in this kind of exciting, dynamic way of the papers flying around and being sent up to the ceiling, to the heavens.
Yes.
I agree. I think you're absolutely right.
I love that.
Yeah, I like that too. Actually, I did like. I mean, that moment, like you say, it's got that 1 minute to go till the presses, and then we decide we're going to publish, and they publish, and then you have this montage, this action sequence of the paper running through the presses and being made into a newspaper, and it's the most exciting printing press I've ever seen in my life.
Well, you haven't seen enough 30s.
Well, no, but it's properly, it's like it really takes glory in the kind of mechanical process of it, and turns into this chase sequence almost. So you're right that it's full of cliches, but I suppose I kind of ignored those, or I suppose I expected them, so I didn't notice how cliched they were. What I noticed was the stuff that I wasn't expecting, which was actually how, for a Spielberg film particularly, it was so angry. It really felt anger, and I think it's actually really pointed at the Trump administration, because I think
it is. I think without a doubt,
and I think that's where it comes from. So you have these shots of Nixon, which are taken as if a spy is shooting them from a long lens outside the White House window, peeping in, and Nixon his back is always to the camera and he's always on the phone. And you hear, I don't know, are they real recordings?
It feels like real recordings.
They definitely feel like real recordings. I don't know if they are or not, but if they are, it just adds to it, because he's complaining about what's happening and who's going back on him and how the papers are getting these papers, the Pentagon Papers, and the film ends with the Post publishing in their entirety, and all the other newspapers publishing as well. And Nixon is on the phone over the closing moments of the film saying, I don't want the Washington Post ever to be allowed into the White House again, or any of their photographers.
Yes.
Which is I'm sure Trump has said something along those lines with the newspaper, like literally banning newspapers.
Exactly, no, he has.
So
yeah.
it's
very resonant.
If you've grown up as I have without Nixon, I didn't grow up in the Nixon years.
I remember his resignation on television, watching his resignation on television.
Well, I grew up in the Clinton years, really, Clinton and Bush. So I didn't know Nixon, but I knew obviously kind of his reputation. But what I didn't realise is just actually that there is a precedent for this kind of thing. When you hear Trump saying this shit about fake news and about how these newspapers are awful and he wants to ban them, and he's just done these fake news awards recently, which is very presidential, you think, God, this is just, what the hell, this is not... And then you watch this, I watched this and I realised there is a precedent for this.
Well...
Nixon... If Nixon
there is no precedent for Trump.
There's no precedent in some respects, but in terms of a president trying to use the power of the presidency and of the government to take down a newspaper.
Lots of presidencies. Yeah,
that's why I didn't quite realise.
And actually, the film shows you because
and it's just his personal anger about it.
Well, they talk though about how Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson all manipulated the press, right?
But that was slightly different because when they talk about Eisenhower and Kennedy, they talk about how they were in with the publishers. This is one of the strands of the film where Katharine Graham, who, as you say, has had a life where she's socialised with these people, and also so has Ben Bradley. Yes. They go back and forth at one point saying, well, you wouldn't have, you didn't say anything bad about this. Yes. And she says, well, you didn't say anything bad about this because he was your friend as well. Yes. And part of the thing of the film is we have to learn to put that aside in order to stand up for what we're supposed to be standing up for. So the way in which the government and the people in power have previously manipulated the press was by being their friends. Yes. Whereas with Nixon on the phone, it's just vitriol and attack and I want them shut down.
Well, they mention how his enemies list. They mention Nixon's enemies list. They say, well, how many people are on it? Oh, thousands. Right?
And there's clearly a difference with Nixon. The way they talk about him and they say he is a dirty bastard and he's different.
Yeah, he's vicious and nasty. But none of the stuff was public the way that the Trump stuff is.
No, you're quite right. That is true. It's not. It is unprecedented in some respects, but not all of them. That's what I kind of realised watching this. Is
anyway, and I also loved how the ending of the film. It says, "Oh my God, I couldn't go through this again," and then the film ends with the robbery at the Watergate. Right. So
it sets up a sequel.
Yeah. So it sets up all the president's men, really.
Yeah, it does.
So I kind of like that.
And also, and I think the film echoes all the President's Men and generally 70s cinema in a way as well, which is there's the one character played by Bob Odenkirk. The one character played by Bob Odenkirk, who's one of the journalists at the Post. He has this. He's the character who goes to meet the whistleblower in the motel room and picks up all the papers and takes them back on the plane. And he has this kind of plot of his own, which is, it's almost camp in how it's evoking 70s cinema. So he thinks, I know this guy and I reckon he knows something. It turns out to be the whistleblower. Someone rings him and he says, I need to take this outside the office. So he goes to a payphone because he reckons he might be bugged. So he goes to a payphone and then he speaks on a payphone and says, I'm looking for so-and-so. And then he's given a different phone number. He drops all this stuff. He remembers the phone number, goes to a different payphone on the same row, rings up again. So it's like, it's all this spy stuff. It's real kind of 70s sort of All the President's Men or The Conversation type stuff. Yes. And it's almost camp in the way that it's evoking these things. It's almost a parody, but it's very loving if it is. Like it's doing it right. And there's a zoom shot in on it, which could not be more transparent in how it's in the way it's doing it, which I adored because it was funny, and it also showed it like it was like compartmentalizing it. It was like saying this is the subplot of the film where we're doing the 70s spy stuff, and the rest of it is slightly different. But this is the All the President's Men type story in the film.
You see, you're so clever because I didn't notice any of that actually. I was really absorbed in the story.
Yeah.
And I kind of. It's only in the second viewing that kind of, those things reveal themselves to me, really. So it's very good of you to point them out. Yeah.
I liked it. I mean, basically, I found it entertaining. I thought it was very knowing. The film is so... I mean, it would be absurd for a film like this to not be sort of having a metatextual conversation with All the President's Men, because that is the defining kind of Nixon and newspaper story.
Yes. So, you know, one of the things about having Bradley and Streep as protagonists, which I thought was kind of misjudged and middle-aged and staid, and, you know, is... Like, for example, you know, when Redford and Hoffman did All the President's Men, they were in their 30s, and actually they were probably a bit old, really. Like, you know, a newsroom should be full of, like, young men hustling, right? Whereas kind of this, everybody seemed to be over 60.
Yeah, I mean, well, yes, I'm not going to pick too many hairs about that. I think you're about right about that. Maybe they are a bit too old, but who knows? I don't know.
Well, it's easy to check, you know, what was the average age of, you know, kind of people working at the Washington Post, you know, kind of. And you would expect them to be a bit older because, you know, they were like senior editors.
Senior editors, yeah.
You know, but kind of to have almost all of them be over 60 is just a bit much, really.
There was a point in it where I think that it's the point where they've got the papers and they're trying to sort them out in Ben Bradley's house, and then this multi-person phone call starts up between Catherine Graham and Ben Bradley and the lawyer and the advisor, and all these people end up on the phone together having this conversation about what we're going to do, we're going to publish or not. And there's a point in that where the essential argument is, will we publish or won't we? And Ben Bradley says we should, and I can't remember who it is, but he's a lawyer or an advisor, says we shouldn't. And it becomes quite heated, and Ben Bradley kind of shouts at one point, if we don't, Nixon wins.
Yeah.
And those two words, Nixon wins, they kind of shocked me in a way, because I was surprised to see a film being so nakedly open about being against the president. Like, the president should be the guy who most people kind of agree with and want to represent them. And to have a film basically saying we have to be against the guy in charge completely, like to a point where it's a win-lose scenario. Either Nixon wins or we win. And it's that kind of 50-50 a fight. That was quite bracing, I thought. And again, I thought that was very much how people feel about Trump. And I think there's a thing. This is something that David Bordwell has written about before. The idea of strategic ambiguity, which is where films don't want to alienate potential sections of the audience, so they don't go out their way to make big political statements one way or the other, and they practice ambiguity so that you can say, well, I saw in it this and I saw in it that, which actually makes for worse art, because I want to know what you think, really. I want to see a message conveyed. And I was very surprised. I suppose it's the level of vitriol
now.
Well, yeah, I think it comes down to it's the level of vitriol against this stuff. Yeah. Yes, but I think it's also so clearly related to what's happening today with Donald Trump and the newspapers and fake news and the rest of it, that I found it... I mean, it's not surprising that basically everyone agrees with that, but I suppose I found it kind of surprising or just unexpected to see it portrayed. Especially in a Spielberg film. Again, I don't know why I have this thing about I don't expect Spielberg to do it, but I don't know why that's necessarily the case.
Well, because his films haven't, to my knowledge, actually, except for Schindler's List, I can't think of another film of his that's been like overtly political the way this one is.
I think you're right. I think his films tend to say, instead of it being like left or right, they tend to just say, isn't America really great?
Or aren't dinosaurs great? Or didn't we love 1930s adventure films?
If they go for a political thing though, it's more the case of America is great and the system is great and the people are great.
Yes.
Never mind this left-right nonsense.
Yes.
We're all wonderful Americans.
Yes.
Whereas this film is very much
even extraterrestrials are fine.
Whereas in the Post, what you get is some Americans are great and some Americans are really not so great and need to be stopped.
Yes. Bloody hell, it's taken him 7 years to get there.
I know. I'm glad he did.
Yeah, he's better at gremlins than he is at people.
But do you know what I mean though? Like, I expected it to be so much more anodyne than it is, and I'm very glad that it wasn't.
You're kinder to it than I am, because I do think that there is something anodyne about it.
Yeah.
And something staid and conservative, certainly cinematically it is. I also think the performances are somehow reined in. There's just something, competent and undynamic about them. It feels to me like, a film. I mean, I think my sister was right, that there's a kind of, sickening earnestness to it.
I think there is up to a point, but like I say, I was glad to see that was tempered by many other things.
Yes.
Yes. One thing it did make me think is, it made me think about what films about Donald Trump's presidency are going to be like in 30 years' time.
They're all going to be farces.
It's the first thing that's really made me think that, because I was thinking, with Donald Trump, he does so much stuff, and like on a daily basis, he does things that any other president would be thrown out of office for. It's incredible, and you can't keep up with how outrageous and how frequently it happens. And so you can't. The fact that you can't predict tomorrow what's going to happen means that you can't even conceive of there being a future in 30 years' time. And this was the first thing that made me think of this as kind of something that will have a legacy, right? What Trump's doing and how the world has changed and how the presidency is changing under him. So, because at the time of Nixon, I guess things must have seemed reasonably similar, and you wouldn't have never have predicted how it would look 30 years hence.
Well,
but you certainly can't with Trump.
I think there was I think what's lost, which is a loss, is kind of a real belief in core values. That kind of, about freedom and liberty and truth, and I think people really did believe it. And, and I think the revelations of the Pentagon Papers, and then Watergate were truly shocking.
Yeah.
I even think Nixon's language was truly shocking. So there was a difference in what these people might say in private. And obviously, people in private were always more complex and, and torn and bitter or whatever. And, than they are. Yeah, but there was this idea that somehow, it was only you or only those, that actually the culture was healthy and free and true. And, so actually these were major revelations, where actually what Trump represents is like a perverted Jerry Lewis comedy of a culture, really,
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of. I mean, I've certainly heard people talk about people who grew up in that era talk about a kind of loss of innocence.
Yes.
And hatred of Richard Nixon for what he did to not only to people but to the post of the presidency and that kind
I remember my dad snorting at me because I was such an idealist, in the 70s, and he would snort that I could believe such stupid things, because I kind of did, and I just thought that he was just a victim of Franco, that he never lived in a democracy, so he couldn't understand how those beliefs could be real.
That's right. I mean, there was like that thing of depressed people always expect the worst, so in a catastrophe, they handle it best because they're expecting the worst to happen anyway.
Oh, that's interesting.
There's something like that going on in sort of the way people become disillusioned by experience. Which is why, when people are young idealists and then they have their illusions shattered, the old people there going, yeah, see, we knew that.
And they're like, fuck off, you shattered them.
Yeah, pretty much.
My disappointment was you. Anyway, any last words on the film?
No, I liked it and I'm glad I saw it and I would see it again. It was very slow at the start, I must say. And actually, it was just not quite what I thought it was. I thought it would be fairly conventional. We've got our hands on these papers, what we're going to do with them. But I didn't expect it to be that the New York Times had them in part.
Yes.
And then we were playing catch-up. The start of the film is about we're playing catch-up and what we're going to do. and then it turns out we can get our hands on them too, and then it becomes a more conventional sort of political expose thriller after that.
Yes. I liked it much more than I expected to, actually, and I would recommend it. There's no question about it. And I liked the look of it. And it was never for 1 second boring. The story is really, really well told. But I feel a bit sad for Spielberg because, it's another one of those films that I certainly don't want to revisit. There's nothing in it that makes me want to see it again.
Okay.
I think that he's a kind of genius craftsman, that he moves the camera in a way like no one else, and so on and so forth. I think we can all agree on, but actually the question remains: to what ends? And I think that's a question that overhangs Spielberg, and I think this is a question. That's a question that this film doesn't answer.
I think that's probably true. It also suffers from that thing, and this is a minor point really, but I always find myself suffering from it. All these films about a load of white guys in rooms talking for a long, long time about intricate matters, they always suffer from the thing of everyone looks the same, and everyone sounds the same, and everyone's got a name, and everyone's got a different role, and they're always significant and important, and you have to know, and they take me so long to learn.
I never bother.
But I think that's it. Like, I don't think anyone does really. But the film still has, like, they're talking about what about Abe at the Times, and what about this guy Neil something, and I'm going, who are these people? Yeah. And when you go to I would like it if everyone had a name tag. It gets or just if everyone introduced myself. Hi, I'm Neil, and now here's my part in the story.
Yes. Speaking, you just reminded me that who I measure. Tom Hanks' performance as Ben Bradley is Jason
Robards.
Jason Robards.
He's great.
Yeah, who played him in All the President's Men. And I think Hanks doesn't bring anything of the abrasiveness and the roughness and, you got the feeling.
Well, he brings
Robards.
He brings a gravelly voice. He's acting with his voice in this, Tom Hanks, which is it.
Yeah. But I love him. And actually seeing him kind of cheers me up, and actually I think that's kind of wrong for this part, really. It should be somebody gravelly voice and with a slightly dark edge, and
J.K. Simmons. Except that he already played.
J.K. Simmons has a sleazy element.
Well,
not just dark.
J.K. Simmons was the editor of the paper in Spider-Man.
Yes.
So obviously he wouldn't work because. That's still his main thing.
Yeah.
Apart from Whiplash, I suppose. But the other Ben Bradley in cinema is Spotlight. Ben Bradley Jr. is played by John Slattery, who is editor of the Boston Globe. Isn't that interesting?
That is interesting.
And again, this is like every newspaper film for me pales in comparison to Spotlight, which I think is just a masterpiece. And what I love about Spotlight is how the people at the paper are culpable just as much as anyone.
Yes.
Because normally what happens in a film like this, and actually it's not always newspapers, the film that made me realise this at first was Concussion, which was the film about the Nigerian doctor who... chronic traumatic encephalopathy, I think, is a disease that he kind of discovered and gave a name to, which is basically... NFL players smashing into each other, their brains get irreparably damaged and small, and he was the one who said this is a problem and we have to accept that this is not an accident, this is happening. And Concussion is a perfectly decent kind of TV movie about that. And it hits all the notes in order of what you should do about a kind of small guy taking on the big guy story. And when I watched that, I realised everything about Spotlight that was unique and brilliant. And the central thing is that the central thesis in Spotlight is what the Stanley Tucci character says, which is if it takes a town to raise a child, if it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to abuse one. And the members of that village are not just the clergy, and they're not just the schools, and not just it's the newspaper as well. The newspaper that overlooked everything. And the central thing in Spotlight is right up until the end, the guys working at the newspaper are saying, we're looking into this, and we're important, and you've got to stop now because we're the Boston Globe. And they don't realise, even right up until the end, that they were part of the problem. And they were covering it up too. And that's great. And this is saying, this is not saying that this film does, not that it's its project, but obviously in this film, we're exposing the truth for all the right reasons, and we're great. But
that's my idea of a great newspaper film is the front page, and I wanted some of the cynicism and darkness and humor and quickness and brightness and smartness.
Yeah.
The zing, and you don't get any of that in the film.
You wanted it to be more His Girl Friday.
Yeah.
Pow, pow, you see?
That's right. Yeah, well, the front page is His Girl Friday, but, with the gender role slightly changed. I did want the pow, pow, fast, quick,
Well, it's funny that you said...
bribe.
It's funny that you said this was like this evoked 40s film to you, because I think it kind of does, except you're right, without any of that speed or fizz.
Or wit.
Yeah, no wits. It's...
And no sexiness whatsoever. Zilch.
I don't know, it has got Michael Stuhlbarg in it.
Who's he?
Very sexy man.
Oh yeah, who's he?
he's the one who plays Abe, the editor at the Times, the Jewish fella with the glasses.
Right.
He's great. Yeah. He was in.
You're bigging yourself up. Is he also slightly overweight in his sexiness?
Slightly. He was in A Serious Man.
Oh,
the Coen film.
Yes, I can't remember.
Yeah. He's very good. I'm slightly taking the piss there. He's not that sexy.
Yes. Anyway, let's end it here, shall we?
And it's got Sarah Paulson in a very underused role.
Yes.
The artist wife. There seems to be something cliche about that, but I can't tell what.
Well, it's a class thing. I didn't mind that really.
Behind every great man is a quiet woman.
It's funny because yesterday you were saying, "Oh, how interesting! This is." Not yesterday, a few days ago, you were saying, this is a film that becomes more interesting to talk about than actually my experience of watching it. And actually, I feel the opposite about this one. That actually I had a really good time watching it. But actually, the more I talk about it, the less it seems.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I think you'll go back in the cinema and go, "Oh, I'm back in the 70s again."
All right, let's end it here.